So, today we're going to rate all the 5 stars from the 5 stars only player perspective and rate them from dog water to deserves a spot in the meta roster. So the part where it deserves a spot in the meta roster basically means that you can use it and you're not gonna have a big disadvantage of using a 5 star instead of a 6 star when you use this character. So basically it is on the same level as some other 6 stars. So that's the S tier. And all the other tiers are pretty self-explanatory. A is a very good operator overall. B is mid. And C is basically a weak operator. So here we go. First is Ptilopsis. Ptilopsis absolutely goes to S. Ptilopsis is one of the strongest medics in the game. Her main selling point is the fact that she gives SP recovery for all of the units on the map, and her S2, despite having a really long charge uptime, it really heals quite a lot. So it is a very strong unit. You can use her in any comp, so don't look down on this one. Zima is absolutely mid. Outside of Vanguard Knights buffs, she doesn't really do much. She's just a solid Pioneer Vanguard, so goes to mid. Texas, though, goes to S because she's a very strong option. She only costs 7 DP to deploy, assuming you have max spot, but 8 DP if you don't, if you have 1. And she gives a lot of DP, so she is actually even faster than Myrtle when you place her. Myrtle still wins DP generation wise over time, yet Texas has block 2. She does damage, arts damage and physical damage, and she has stun, so she has utility as well, and she's pretty good overall. So she's a very good solo Vanguard too. She's absolutely S tier. Franca is C. You can use her. She does mid damage, but she's not really impressive in any sort of way. So she's C. Next is Indra. Indra is a very good option. Even though her skill costs quite some SP, it is really worth it. Her S2 does arts damage, quite a decent DPS, and also heals herself, so she doesn't die and she can 1v1 elite enemies. So that is a really strong character. I mean, of course, like, she's not really compared to meta units, but she only costs 8 DP to deploy, and she does a lot for her cost. Next is Lapland. So Lapland in 5 stars only is absolute S tier because you always take her. But in reality, if we compare her to 6 star units as well, she is more of just a good unit. She isn't really shining. Her main niches are solid DPS and silence, and there is nothing more to say about her. Next is Spectre. So Spectre is also A tier. She's very good, although I cannot put her in S tier because most of the time her survivability skill that makes her invincible doesn't really do much, and she doesn't really do damage as well. So most of the time this skill that gives her invincibility is not going to be used, which is the reason why she's not S tier. So basically she is very strong for stalling, although that niche doesn't really pop up very often. So Spectre is A tier, still a very good unit. Blue Poison is mid. Her damage is mid, and that's all she has about her. There's really nothing more to say about her. Next is Platinum. Same thing. She is kind of mid, and her damage is basically on the same level of Blue Poison. So she's not gonna be broken, although she isn't really bad either. So a mid tier unit. Next is Meteorite. Meteorite is a solid unit. There isn't really much to say about her. She only does damage, so Yeah, mid tier. Next is Amiya. Amiya is actually a very good unit. She's not S tier because she does mid damage, but she still is a very good unit, and she does true damage, which comes in handy at times, especially when you are playing 5-stars only. So if you can use her, and I can use her with 5-stars only, she carries quite a lot. She is an A tier unit. I think you can use her. Next is Skyfire, and Skyfire is kind of dog water because her damage is really bad. She's a splash caster, and her stun is like non-existent. The range of her S2 splash is good, but it is also delayed for no reason, and really she's not a good unit. Next is Mayer. Mayer is C tier just because she is a summoner. So the thing is, she doesn't provide anything special, and her summons aren't really as good. So I kind of lied about her not providing anything special because her S1 reduces the enemy's attack speed when they are blocked by the units that stand in the 4 adjacent tiles of her summons, or blocked by summons themselves. But like, who is going to use that? It's a very CC niche, and I don't think it's even the best option we have. So Mayer is good, but only under correct circumstances. So C tier. Next is Silence. Silence is a very strong unit. The thing is, she is even better than Shining most of the time because her healing output is way, way bigger. Her buff, her talent, gives a medic's attack speed, which is very useful, especially if you pair her like with Telopsis. You probably won't need healing anymore. And Shining gives defense, yet it's not really a useful niche in ARKNIGHTS. So Silence is a very, very strong medic, and she shouldn't be underrated. Who shouldn't be overrated is the Warframe. Warframe is a very good option, yet she's not S tier because her damage buff is not always 90%. Because there are a lot of operators that you'd like to buff, yet they have skills that give them attack. So most of the time, her 90% attack buff is not going to be a 90% buff. It is going to be like 45% buff. It really does make you question, is she worth it? Her S1 can be useful in a lot of ways, although it's not like the craziest healing DPS, and she's still only healing one target at a time. And her SP battery is absolutely amazing, yet not really useful most of the time. So she goes to A tier. She's still a very good unit. She provides a lot of support, so A tier. Next is Neural. Neural is basically budget Saria. She doesn't really differ from Saria all that much. There are some things Saria is better than her, although Neural's talent that gives all allies an increased healing effect is a very good talent and can really solve the healing problem for the team. So she's a very solid unit. I really recommend you to build her, as she is also block free, which is quite useful at times. Next is Project Red. Project Red fell off. So Project Red used to be a very, very strong 5-star, yet now a lot of enemies have stun immune, and a lot of enemies have insane HP for Project Red. Her DPS is very low. She does pierce defense in some way. She always does 40% of her attack, yet her DPS is so low that it doesn't matter. So she's still going to be bad no matter what. She's not terrible, okay? You can use her in some cases, but she's very mid. Next is Liskarm. Liskarm is actually a very good unit. Liskarm has a resistance buff from her talent. and she has some defensive skills that are quite useful. She also provides an SP battery, yet I cannot say you'll always make use of it. So she's not always worth the slot in your team, although she does provide quite some support with that SP battery. Next is Croissant. Croissant is very mid. She's just a normal defender. Not much to say about her. Her shit basically doesn't change anything. Next is Vulcan. Vulcan is mid. She is useful against some enemies, yet she's not good in any way. She doesn't bring anything new. And the thing is, the game releases enemies that are supposed to counter Penance and Mudrock, so that Vulcan is actually not so useful anymore. Basically, it is a simple stat check, and Vulcan doesn't really pass it most of the time. Next is Prudence. Prudence is a very niche unit. I would even say she's C tier, although her damage is very good. So you could argue she's B tier, especially if she crits all the time. She does become quite strong, although she's RNG based and her SP cost is very, very big. And also the condition that only makes her target enemies below 80% HP is quite annoying, so she's B tier. Next is Firewatch. Firewatch is also B tier. Can be quite useful at times, although most of the time her invisibility is kind of useless and you only get mid-tier DPS. She does well against ranged enemies, although that's the only thing you could ever possibly use her for. So B tier. Next is Cliffguard, and I would like to address that all the shifters are going to B tier because there isn't really a big difference between all of them. They're very situational and there isn't really a reason to put one above the other. So yeah, all the shifters are going to B tier. Next is Pramanix. Pramanix is a very good support. She is good, but not S tier because her range is quite small and it takes quite a big setup to actually use her. So while she is very strong, she is going to be A tier. So next is Istina. Istina is still a solid unit, although she isn't really strong in any way. She does what she does, and she does it pretty solid B tier. Next is Sora. Sora is actually weak. I would say that her sleeping niche is only used for sleep nights, and her damage buff is not really strong. It doesn't justify you to bring her in the squad. So C tier. Next is Manticore. Manticore is either A tier, either B tier. She's really good at CC type of stuff where you need slow. Although most of the time she's going to be B tier because her damage is bad and she doesn't really do much besides the slow. So she's not going to be as useful in the normal game. So B tier. Next is Savage. Savage is just a mid Centurion guard. She doesn't really do much. She basically does damage and does it well, so she does her job. B tier. Next is Nightmare. Nightmare is dog water because her S1 has an insane SP cost and doesn't really do much. The range is still terrible, and her S2, while is a little bit better, it does some CC at least, it does slow. It doesn't make any sense because it does damage for the distance the enemy travels, and it also slows the enemy so it travels less. It really makes no sense, so dog water. Next is Granny. Unfortunately for Granny, she is terrible. She is not a Vanguard because she's supposed to give DP through being offensive, but she is defensive, so she cannot do offense, she cannot kill enemies, so she cannot give DP. There absolutely is no reason to get her because she just doesn't work. Next is Glaucus. Glaucus is a very solid Dessel binder. Her nuke is quite useful, although isn't broken in any way. A B tier unit's nothing much to say about her. Next is Swire. Swire is instructor guards, and instructor guards are just terrible. She is quite mid Like, she can buff someone, but it just doesn't justify to bring her for just the buff. Like, there are a lot of better units that do much more than she does. So building her is absolutely a disaster. I don't really know what are you doing here. Next is Aesthesia. Aesthesia is very weak units. She does mid damage. That's the problem. She is supposed to be defensive with her skill. She can also have block 2 with her skill. Although the problem is that her damage is bad. She isn't really good at what she does. Aesthesia is C tier. Next is Executor, just overall a good DPS, though there is nothing else that he offers, so B tier. Next is Breeze. Breeze is solo carried by her archetype. She is pretty okay, though she's hard to get and there is not a big reason to actually build her, though she is solid if you do, so B tier. Next is Flamebringer. Flamebringer, he can work, like he can 1v1 bosses, but the meta is so strong right now that the bosses also evolved and all that stuff, so he's not going to be able to be useful in the game right now. Like, if it were to be the first year of ARKNIGHTS, he could be solid, but nowadays he's quite bad, so C tier. Next is Ceylon. Ceylon is overall pretty mid, has star resistance with her S2, does pretty mid healing, but overall is a B tier unit. Next is Waifu. Waifu is an executioner. She is very underwhelming compared to the other two executioners. Although she has some potential use, she just doesn't make a little bit of sense that she's an executor, so she's mostly going to be used to kill someone, although she doesn't really have that good of a DPS, so she's not quite the executor, so she's supposed to be used with other units, which does limit her to an extent, although she's still a very solid unit, so B tier. Next is Bison. Bison is a very good tank. He has a lot of defense, but that's all he has, so A tier. Next is Reed. Reed is kind of bad, although she still does quite some damage with her skill. The only problem is that her DP generation is pretty bad, and she doesn't really offer much. And the fact that she got power creep by the module is just insane. So C tier. Next we have Brocca. Brocca is a Centurion Guard. He's pretty mid. Nothing much to say about him, just a DPS unit. Next is Greythroat. Greythroat is also a B tier unit. She does pretty decent DPS, and that's kind of it, so B tier. Next is Hun. Hun is also B tier. Well, you could argue, well, his defensive recovery is really bad. He still does heal pretty well, especially with his S2, B tier. Next is Lazy. Lazy is a very good unit, actually. She does good DPS. She does good slow, and overall just a very solid unit. Next is Bybig. Bybig is also A tier unit. A very strong stun option. If the enemy isn't stun immune, she's very strong. And overall she's also pretty decent as a unit, so A tier. Next is Sessa. Sessa does pretty decent damage, although the bombs take quite a while to explode, so he's quite mid. Next is Siderocker. Siderocker has quite a good survivability, so she's going to B tier. And her only issue is that she's block 1. Everything else, she's a very good tank. So if there are a lot of ranged enemies, she can tank most of the hits with her S2. Next is Chimère. Chimère is a very strong unit. She debuffs attack and defense of the enemy, and she has a doll which works like Scotty's summon. It basically is global, and it works very well, especially if the enemy is doing a lot of damage. Her attack debuff is very useful. Next is Elysium. Elysium is almost on the same level as Texas, but it depends on whether you have the synergy, which is Backpipe, to boost him. So the only reason why Elysium is lower than Texas is the fact that as a solo Vanguard, he's not really good. So he does bring a lot of utility. He does give a lot of DP, yet if you try to deploy him early on, you can get screwed by the rush. So he is a very strong unit if you play around his weaknesses, although he's A tier because of his weaknesses. So next is Asbestos. Asbestos is a very strong arts tank, but that's the only thing she has. So B tier. Tsukinagi. Tsukinagi is unfortunately not a good unit, although she's not dog water. Her only problem is the SP cost. It is just lame to wait so long until you can use her skill, even though she provides quite a strong dodge or provides quite some sanctuary with her S2. You just wait way too long for it to have C tier. Next is Absinthe. Absinthe is a very solid caster, not much to say. Next is Leonhard. Leonhard is a very strong caster actually. He has a very cool talent that buffs his damage. He has range extension with his S2 attack, so a very solid unit actually. Next is Folinic. Folinic is kind of garbage. She still works as a medic, but she doesn't really offer anything, so C tier. And next is the... I don't remember his name. This guy does mid damage if you have blockers. Most of the time he's kind of useless because there is just no setup for him to really work well, so C tier. Next is Scene. Scene is the stronger summoner actually. She reveals enemies, and it is one of the strongest ways to reveal enemies. Her summons are also very good. They're quite tanky. They do quite some damage. Overall, strong units, although it takes quite a lot of deployment slots. Next is Beeswax. Beeswax is just a mid unit. She does decent damage. She can make a summon that blocks enemies, and just overall mid. Next is Chiavi. Chiavi is also mid. He does bring Arts Res debuff on the enemies, although that's not really broken for a Vanguard. A B tier unit. Next is Adriana. Adriana is very good. In the Abyssal Hunters, she can be S tier. Her damage is very good, although she cannot finish enemies by herself, so A tier. Next is Tamimi. Tamimi is dog water. She is a caster that doesn't even do arts damage with her skill. Like, what the hell is that? So she does physical damage with her skills. Her range is decreasing heavily to 3 adjacent tiles to her, and it does RNG as well. So like this is terrible. Dog water. Next is Flint. Flint is just very uninspired. She shifts enemies away from her, although that's the only thing she does, and her damage is terrible. Next is Mint. Mint is decent as a DPS, and her shift is quite situational, still B tier. April doesn't really pierce late game enemies. Can be used against certain enemies, although still B tier. Next is Zofia. Zofia is a little bit better, like you can proc her talent, although it's kind of bad still, so C tier. She also has better stats than the others from her class. Aosta is also C tier. Does pretty good damage, although he has a very stupid gimmick where he doesn't do arts damage that he does to blocked enemies. Why would they add that? I don't know. Next is Wishbrain. Wishbrain is overall a solid medic. Next is Amiya. Amiya Guard is mid-tier units because her buff isn't really as strong, and her S2 can only be used once and is not really as strong to justify that. And S1 is very good but situational. So Kafka. Kafka is a pretty good unit, although overall she's kind of mid. Her damage is mid. Her sleep is pretty good for stalling, so B tier. Next is Robin. Robin has shift, Robin has bind, and overall is a B tier unit. Next is Iris. Iris is also a B tier unit, has nice sleep, can stall therefore, and overall just a solid unit. Next is Toya. Toya doesn't really offer anything. but does offer good healing, so B tier. Next is Lava the Purgatory. Lava the Purgatory does mid damage, so B tier. Next is this guy. This guy is absolute trash. I don't see a reason to use this guy. He only drains your DP while doesn't really provide anything useful, so dog water. Next is the Tachanka. Tachanka has a nice DPS. Can be really good if you have debuffers and buffers, although most of the time he is quite mid, so B tier. Next is Blitz, also a mid tier unit. He has quite some useful abilities like stun and all that stuff. He has DPS with his S2, although overall still a very solid unit, but mid unit, B tier. Next is Frost. Frost is also B tier. Pretty strong traps, but not broken traps. They're kind of just mid. Next is Haverain. Haverain is also pretty mid, just does her role pretty well. Next is Stadifont. Stadifont does mid damage, just solo carried by her archetype, but yeah, that's it. Next is Akafuyu. Akafuyu is also a very mid-tier unit. She does good damage with her S1. Her main problem is that she doesn't really pierce defense all that well, so while she has quite some decent survivability, she doesn't pierce defense, so B tier. Bena is Dull Keeper. Dull Keepers are overall just a good archetype, so B tier. Kirara does solid damage, although doesn't really block enemies and is not really useful most of the time, so C tier. La Pluma is a very good unit, although nothing really broken about her. She does good damage, although that's kind of all she does, so A tier. Tequila is a very strong 5-star. He can do quite some damage, although I wouldn't say he is S tier, though he is very close to S tier, so consider that. Mulberry is a solid elemental medic, though elemental healing isn't as useful in the game. You can most of the time just tank the elemental hits, so that is pretty mid, B tier. Next is Ashlock. Her damage is too low to pierce high defense, so B tier. Next is Colosseum. Colosseum can work if you have a lane, but that's too situational, so dog water. Next is Wildmane. Wildmane is a solid unit. She does provide quite a strong utility of her shift. Her shift is very strong, although it is quite situational, so I cannot justify the reason to put her into A or S. Next is Honeyberry, basically just a worse version of Mulberry, but still solid, so B tier. Kiara is terrible, doesn't really freeze on her own. I mean, she does freeze, yet it's RNG, and her damage is terrible, so dog water. Next is Aurora. Aurora has quite a nice survivability, although has to be carried by Gnosis. Her damage is very good if the enemy is frozen, although the enemy has to be frozen. She can freeze enemies on her own, yet it is like very hard to actually do. Next is Shalem. Shalem is a solid defender, does solid damage, although why would you need your defender to do damage and also die while doing damage? That's the only question I have for him. Next is Black Knight. Black Knight is overall solid. She used to be broken in CC8, and she is still like a useful 5-star, although not really as strong to actually carry you the game. She most of the time doesn't really impact the game all that much, although she is useful, so B tier. Next is Cruise Halter. Cruise Halter does very nice DPS, does nice stun, although is not really S tier in terms of DPS and all the other utilities, so A tier. 9-color Deer is pretty okay, but that's all I can say. Same goes for Quercus. Unreliable SP battery. If she were to give a better SP battery, I could have considered putting her A, although yeah, she doesn't really work all that well in such a case. Next is Casimiro. Casimiro is a very strong 5-star. Is a Dull Keeper, does really good damage. and has a nice survivability, so A tier. Heidi is also a very good unit, gives block, gives damage, and even though she removes block when you buff your allies with damage, it is really easy to avoid leaks. She does give a lot of damage overall, so you can either kill the enemy, either buff your ranged units, and you can't really go wrong with her, so A tier. Next is Rock. Rock is quite a solid unit. Her damage is good, although the range is bad, and she's only really good when she can lock on the enemy, and he has a really long path that doesn't run into your operators, and she can do a lot of damage in such a scenario. Next is Winfleet, absolute dog water for dog. So terrible buffs, terrible damage, terrible units. Next is Erato. Erato is solo carried by her archetype. Does good damage, but that's the only thing she does. She does sleep, but again, not useful for all the players. Next is Zerny. Zerny is pretty mid. He does his job very well. He does nice arts damage, although he's not really broken in any way. He's just solid at what he is. Next is Hibiscus Altar. Hibiscus Altar applies arts fragility and does decent damage. Also does slow, and overall is a B tier unit. Minimalist is dog water because he just doesn't really do much damage, and his skill doesn't really work with his archetype, so it doesn't really make sense why he even exists. So dog water. Next is Cantabile. Cantabile is very good, really useful in a lot of ways, so A tier. Next is Aesthesia. Aesthesia is a solid DPS, B tier. Greythroat is also a solid DPS, B tier. Proviso is a very strong unit. She does silence, she does AoE damage, she does slow. She has increased attack speed, so she slows the enemy by a huge amount. Her SP cost is quite low. She also has a talent that buffs another Casimir operator and herself by 10 attack speed and a percentage of attack. So it is really useful, especially if you can like literally give Munar 10% DPS. Like it is very strong. Next is Dagda. Dagda is a C tier unit. She's weak. Her damage with her S2 is pretty solid. Her survivability with S1 is pretty solid, although why would you ask for a guard with low attack, low HP to be defensive? Like, there is just no reason for her. Next, Paprika. Paprika doesn't really bring anything to the roster, B tier. Next is our Highmore. Highmore isn't as strong as La Pluma is, and her damage is pretty okay. Her dodge is pretty okay, but overall her elemental damage healing is pretty mid, so B tier. Next is Lunacup. Lunacup is B tier. She can be useful against some enemies, although only useful against some enemies. Her attack stat is very low to actually pierce most of the enemies, so B tier. Next is Puzzle. Puzzle is heavily boosted by his archetype. Still does very good DP gen, but overall a mid-tier unit. Next is the Polar Bear, Quanipalat, and I wouldn't really justify a reason to build him. He does RNG levitation, but just overall he's an underwhelming unit, so C tier. Harmony is a solid unit. She does good damage against block enemies, but that's the only thing she does, so B tier. Next is Ji-Yoon. Ji-Yoon does good slow, good damage, although not really as strong, so B tier. So Fire Whistle does very good damage actually, although she isn't really broken anyway. She's still a very good unit, so A tier. Next is Wind Chimes. Wind Chimes is very fragile, so I would actually say that Quartz is most of the time actually better than Wind Chimes. And it's the fact that her skill is really hard to use because it's only one tick. It requires setup, it requires you to watch on the enemies that you want to hit to time it right, and overall just a very unpleasant unit, C tier. Next is Norcorn. Norcorn is just mid. He is fun to play, although he's not really good, so B tier. Morgan is also very strong. She does a lot of DPS, although she's quite fragile, so B tier. Next is Cement. Cement has a lot of defense, although that defense isn't really useful most of the time, so B tier. Melanite has decent damage, although overall too decent, so B tier. Next is Insider, and Insider is very, very mid, okay? He does decent damage, but that's the only thing he does, so B tier. Spore is absolute dog water. Terrible buffs, dies and doesn't really provide anything with her S1, so dog water. Next is Santala. Santala is also dog water. Her freeze is very inconsistent, and there is no reason to justify building her. Next is Valarquin. Valarquin is B tier. So she is going to be very useful with Ivanhoe's mod free, although outside of that niche, she's not really strong in any way. So her damage when she applies the necrosis effect, Fallout, is pretty good, although it's not really broken. So it's not gonna kill a boss. That's the thing. It's not strong enough to kill a boss, and it overall is just B tier. Next is Pancirus. Pancirus is quite underwhelming, although she is pretty defensive and does decent DP gen. So overall just B for mid. Next is Bryophyta. Bryophyta is on the same level as Zofia and doesn't really bring anything strong to the game, so C tier. Next is Colshot. Colshot does decent damage, although works kind of like a core caster. The problem is she works like a core caster, like she charges the bullets to actually do something impactful, but her range is huge. So the thing is that most of the time you're going to try to use her against paths where are only elite enemies or boss enemies, so she doesn't really waste her damage in. So yeah, that's the thing. The last unit that we have, I don't really remember her name, and she is a shifter and she is pretty mid, so B tier. And that concludes our tier list. We only have 5 units in S tier, quite some units in A tier. Most of the 5 stars are pretty mid, and some are absolute dog shit. So keep in mind, this is my personal opinion, but I have a lot of 5 stars built and I tried all of them multiple times. So this is my honest, unbiased experience on all of those units. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Bye.